Okay, we'll stay in the northwest coast area of Canada and the United States because these objects are all in that same area. And they're kind of interesting because there's similarities and there's differences. First, we have this knife. It looks like an ordinary chopping knife to us, but this is a very typical kind of implement which was used by Inuits and Eskimos as what was called a woman's knife. This was a knife that a woman in a family would use for all her sort of household chores, for chopping food, for cutting things, for skinning animals, for scraping the skins, to cleaning fish. She would handle that with this sort of implement. Some of these are very old. The old ones don't have metal blades. This one has a metal blade, which marks it as being from probably after 1800, maybe into the early 1900s, but certainly about 100 years old or more. The real old ones could be as old as 1,000 or 2,000 years, and they would have slate blades from ground slate, like paving slates or housing, roofing slates, or conversely, they would be made with some other material, sometimes ivory from walrus tusks or something like that. So this metal in here marks this as being relatively recent. What it does have is an interesting handle. The handle is made of walrus ivory, and this walrus ivory is not new. This has been aged, and it makes me think that this is probably more from the 1800s than the 1900s because of the stain which this ivory has. The staining on this ivory often comes from being buried. These things are being used and they may fall out of use. They may get into a section of the winter house or the summer house where they're not cleaned up and things get piled under them, and gradually they get inundated with other stuff and they end up in the soil. And the soil up in the area where these things come from, which is in the Bering Straits region of Alaska, it gets cold and it gets frozen. You get permafrost, and when you get permafrost, what happens is that the ivory tends to suck up some of the organic colors, the tannins out of the soil, and they turn this yellow and brown, and the very old ones can be very, very dark brown, almost black. So this is an interesting one that way. But what's even more interesting, if you look closely at it, you can see that there's carving on the end of this handle. And if you look at it just correctly, there's a polar bear here that's looking this way. You can see his chin and his snout and his two ears and his eyes, and it's a very, very interesting thing carving which is done on this. You don't often see these things elaborately carved like that, but this is one of them. So it's a nice thing called an ulu, U-L-U, and it's the woman's knife of the Inuits and Eskimos. Now this next tool, and it is a tool, is made of wood, most likely again yellow birch or spruce, and this again comes from that northwest coast series of tribes along the British Columbia coast. This one probably comes from Washington, the state of Washington, and it probably belonged to a tribe that's known as the Quinault tribe, Q-U-I-N-A-U-L-T, and they're south of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington on the coast. But again, it's got that same form of sort of a blade held above it. This one has a hand hold in it. Some of the ulus are made this way too. But this one has not a sharp blade on the bottom, it has a rather convex groove in here. And what this is used for is to mash cedar bark. These people depended a lot upon cedars and spruce trees for various things which they made and used. And one of the things they used spruce bark for, and cedar bark, was to mash, and the groove on the bottom would be used to either rub or pound cedar bark, which was macerated by soaking it in water. And the idea would be to make strips, flattened strips of cedar bark, which they could then trim and then weave into mats and even clothing. So they made shirts and outerwear out of cedar bark mashed by these cedar bark mashers, or sometimes they're called creasers. But this one is also interesting because although it's wood, it's also got a bear carved in it right at the tip, just like this ulu has a bear. This bear is a lot less ornate than the ivory carved one, but if you look closely at it, you can see it has sort of a long open snout, which is typical of the bears that are depicted in this Northwest Coast art, and it has an eye with a definite pupil carved in it here. So it makes a rather interesting little adornment for this otherwise plain cedar bark masher. And while we're mentioning using trees and cedar bark and so forth for making clothing, these tribes throughout the Northwest Coast also used roots of spruce trees, spruce roots. They would dig up the root systems from these huge spruce trees, and women would typically spend a lot of time cleaning off the long root hairs and then splitting them. And you're painstakingly taking these things and cutting them and then stripping them into long strands. And they use these to make baskets, hats, various other items. And so we have a spruce root basket, which is what this is. And we'll get a close-up of this, but you can see the very, very fine weaving of this spruce root material and then coloring it. This particular one has a canoes, one on either side, and these are the canoes that this particular tribe used in whaling. This tribe is the Makah tribe, the M-A-K-A-H, and they were whalers, and their land, today's reservation, but their tribal territory in the old days, back in the 1800s or so, was on the Olympic Peninsula in the state of Washington. And Makahs still live there, have their reservations in that area. And they made these very, very fine spruce root baskets, some of them with whaling scenes on them. Their whaling was kind of interesting because they used huge, long-poled harpoons with harpoon blades formed out of walrus ivory and then cemented with spruce gum into the wrappings of spruce roots again that they made their line out of. And I can show you one thing about this. It's kind of interesting if you ever see these, and you see them fairly frequently if you go to antiques shows and whatnot. On the bottom, you can see that the center part of this is made around bits of spruce bark, which has been handled, as I said here, and then woven, into a mat, over and under and over and under. And then the spruce root proper is then begun to be woven around this, and then up around it, and you can see that the design on this isn't painted. Rather, the design is created by spruce root that has been dyed in different colors and then woven into the substance of the basket. And one more thing about this, the older ones, they started making these from at least the 1860s. The older ones were likely to have less of this starting of these spruce bark crisscrosses here, but rather they would start coiling and doing the weaving right from the center. And basically speaking, the more of this mat you see on the bottom indicates that the younger it is. The real old ones have almost none of this. The later ones have more of it. So even though they started this in the 1860s, this probably wasn't made until 1900 or 1910, something like that, based on the amount of this which is in the basket. So there are three kind of interesting items that all have to do with the Pacific Northwest.